Before Laura Mitchell found herself basking under the warm Palm Springs sun, her life had already been a testament to resilience and reinvention. Long before she considered returning to detective work, she had endured one of the toughest chapters of her life. The accident that took her right leg left more than just physical scars. It left emotional ones that lingered long after the surgeries ended. Back then, New York's crowded streets were both a source of comfort and a reminder of what she had lost. Selling her share of the detective agency felt like shutting the door on a part of herself, the part that thrived on unraveling mysteries and bringing justice to those who couldn't find it on their own. The move to Portland had been James's idea, a fresh start. But for Laura, it was also an escape, a way to put distance between herself and the ghosts of old cases, the relentless energy of a city that never slept. The transition, however, wasn't seamless. Portland's slower, rain-soaked streets couldn't have been more different from Manhattan's constant hum. Finding her footing, both physically and mentally, wasn't easy. Yet, in time, she discovered a different rhythm. The tight-knit community, the quieter pace, even the ever-present drizzle became something like a cleansing ritual, washing away remnants of her past. Volunteering at a support group for amputees gave her a renewed sense of purpose. Her story, of loss, perseverance, and reinvention, became a beacon for others. Those years of reflection unknowingly set the stage for her return to detective work, reigniting a passion that had never truly faded. Now, as she lounged poolside in Palm Springs, the heat felt like more than just a vacation. It was a milestone, proof of how far she'd come. Laura's eyes drifted shut, her paperback slipping from her fingers as she dozed. The warmth wrapped around her like a second skin, until a shadow fell across her. She stirred, groggy and annoyed. "You're blocking my sun," she muttered. Pushing up her sunglasses, she found James standing over her, grinning as he handed her an icy daiquiri. "Figured you might need a top-up," he said, his eyes twinkling. Laura smirked, accepting the glass. "Trying to get me tipsy?" James chuckled as he took the chair beside her. "Nah, just loosening you up." She arched a brow. "Oh yeah? And then what?" His grin widened. "Then I'd take you upstairs and wear you out." Laura laughed, shaking her head. "Like I've ever needed booze for that." It was only their second day in Palm Springs, and they were soaking up every second of sunshine after enduring one of Portland's harshest winters in years. The break from the gloom had been overdue. James cracked open a beer and settled back, watching her for a moment longer than usual. Laura noticed. "What now?" she asked. He smirked. "Didn't expect to see you rocking such a tiny bikini." She scoffed. "Hey, not my fault I still look this good." Then, rolling her eyes, she added, "Can't believe I let you talk me into this. I'm 48, a mom of 2, Emma's 20 next month." "You still look incredible," he said, his voice softer now. She had picked a quieter corner of the pool, self-conscious about her appearance. Her right leg ended above the knee, the left bore scars from the accident. For years, she had hidden them. Now, here she was, showing more skin than she had in a decade. Taking a sip of her drink, she turned to him. "I've been thinking." James lifted a brow. "Once Nathan graduates next year, I don't want to just sit around. I'm considering renting office space downtown, getting back into detective work. You're still years from retirement, and I need to stay busy." He wasn't surprised. If anything, he'd expected this moment to come sooner. James knew the kind of energy Laura had when working a case. Honestly, he was amazed she had stayed away this long. She waited as he processed the news, then broke the silence herself. "I hate meeting clients in coffee shops, and our home office isn't cutting it anymore. I found a place in the Pearl District, $7.50 a month. COVID hit landlords hard, so it's a steal. What do you think?" James's lips curled into a smile. "That's close to my office. Sounds like a good deal. You thinking about hiring help?" "Not yet," Laura said, shaking her head. "I'll start slow, build things up again. Besides, advertising's easy now. I don't need the yellow pages anymore." They chatted as they finished their drinks, the conversation flowing effortlessly. When James set his empty glass down, Laura gave him a sly look. "Let's head back to the room," she murmured. He didn't need convincing. Gathering their things, he trailed behind as she moved ahead on her crutches. Her prosthetic stayed behind. Salt water and artificial limbs didn't mix. Watching her, he admired her confidence before catching up. An hour later, James lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling with a contented grin. Laura was curled against him, her breathing soft and even. Even after all these years, moments like this still felt new. Special. How did I get this lucky? His thoughts drifted back to the day they met. Laura, 6 months pregnant, tripping on subway stairs and quite literally falling into his life. Her brief fling with Emma's father, Ryan Carter, had fizzled out before she even realized she was expecting. Ryan, a federal agent, had been reassigned overseas before Emma was even born. Though he agreed to provide support, it was James who stepped in after that subway accident, buying Laura a coffee and never looking back. A few dates later, he was hooked. With Ryan's blessing, James adopted Emma when she was 3 months old, just after he and Laura tied the knot. 19 years had passed since then. Emma was finishing her first year at Oregon State, and Nathan was preparing for high school graduation. Soon, it would be just the two of them. James smiled at the thought of slow mornings with Laura. No rush, no interruptions. That thought alone lulled him to sleep. That evening, the resort's Italian restaurant buzzed with conversation. Laura had opted for tailored pants and a sleeveless blouse. Skirts were off-limits unless she could pair them with thick leggings to cover her prosthetic and scars, but tonight was too warm for that. They had barely placed their orders when it happened. At a nearby table, a drunken woman's voice slurred above the chatter. "Did you see that MILF by the pool? Damn, cover those legs." Her companion stiffened. "Linda, stop," she hissed. Linda just laughed, louder this time. "What? It's not my fault her stump's gross." A few heads turned. The men at the next table glanced over, right at Laura, who stood frozen in place. One of the men shot to his feet, his jaw tightening. He grabbed Linda's arm. "Greg, Beth, get her out of here. I need to apologize." Her companions hurried her outside, their faces burning with shame. The man turned back, looking directly at Laura. "I won't ask for forgiveness," he said quietly. "There's no excuse. I just want you to know I'm sorry." He hesitated, then walked away. Laura slid her hand into James's. "I can't eat," she whispered. James saw the tears she was fighting. Just yesterday, he had encouraged her to ignore the stares, to embrace the moment. She had taken a huge step, swimming, wearing that bikini, feeling like herself again. And now this. He waved the waiter over, canceling their order. The man nodded, sympathy in his eyes. "I'm really sorry, folks. Hope the rest of your night gets better." Back in their room, Laura barely made it to the bed before the tears came. In 20 years together, James could count on one hand the times he had seen her cry. He sat beside her, pulling her into his arms without a word. After a while, she wiped her face and let out a wry laugh. "Did I ever tell you I was voted best legs in high school? God, I had amazing legs." James gave a faint smile. He had heard that story before. Laura's mother had shared it while they waited through her amputation surgery. When her tears faded, he nudged her gently. "How about some fresh air?" She nodded, and they wandered through the resort, eventually settling on a bench near the golf course. The desert night was warm, stars scattered overhead. "I'm overreacting, aren't I?" she murmured. James chuckled. "You? Overreacting?" She smirked. "So, my legs didn't win you over?" "Nope," he said, squeezing her hand. "It was your fire." Laura laughed, shaking her head. "Fire? That was me, overheated and pregnant on a subway, about to faint." She exhaled, her voice softening. "I'm not letting some drunk ruin our vacation. Let's get a drink. Maybe a snack. Not a full meal, but I need something." They returned to the bar, feeling lighter than before. They had just sat down when the assistant manager approached. "There you are, Mrs. Mitchell," he said, slightly winded. "I knocked earlier but saw you here. Mr. Caldwell asked me to give you this note and let you know your entire stay, including food and drinks, has been covered." James raised an eyebrow. "The Caldwells already left?" "Yes, sir. Everything's settled." He handed Laura the envelope and walked away. Laura unfolded the letter and read aloud. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell, I wanted to personally apologize for my wife's appalling behavior. Unfortunately, I'm not surprised. To be blunt, Mrs. Caldwell is selfish and cruel. This trip was her idea, but tonight only confirmed why we're headed for divorce. I've had enough, and so have our friends. Please know her words don't reflect how most people think. I hope you enjoy the rest of your stay. As a small gesture, your room and all expenses have been covered. Sincerely, Robert Caldwell. Laura handed the letter to James. Well, I'll be damned, he muttered. The next few days weren't perfect, but they managed to enjoy themselves, soaking in the sun and the quiet moments. By the time they returned to Portland, they were tanned, rested, and more at peace than they had been in months. 4 months later, Laura sat at her desk, muttering curses at her computer. Whoever claimed QuickBooks was simple had clearly never met her. Without Nathan's help, she would be lost. She decided to leave the bookkeeping for the weekend. Unpaid invoices could wait. The fact that there were invoices to send at all felt like a victory. 3 months into relaunching Mitchell Investigations, business was thriving. She was covering rent, paying expenses, and even tucking a little away for retirement. Her old friend, Captain Glenn Hutchins from the Portland PD, had sent plenty of cases her way. After she cracked the Miller homicide case, referrals hadn't stopped coming. Just last month, she had tracked down a 15-year-old runaway hiding in the mountains with a 25-year-old drifter. The girl's parents were relieved, though Laura knew their battle was far from over. Laura leaned back in her chair, exhaling. Yeah, she was back. The teen Laura had recently found showed clear signs of Stockholm Syndrome. It would take months of therapy before she fully recovered, but at least she was safe now. Meanwhile, routine background checks for corporate clients kept the bills paid. If business continued at this pace, Laura might even need part-time help. Not a bad problem to have, she thought, grabbing her purse for lunch. Just as she reached the door, the phone rang. She sighed and turned back. Mitchell Investigations, this is Laura. A man's voice came through, steady but tense. Good morning, Miss Mitchell. My name is David Reynolds. I need help with a paternity issue. Can we meet? Laura glanced at her schedule. I'm available tomorrow at 9 a.m. Does that work? I'll be there. The address on your website, right? Yes, she confirmed. When you arrive, dial 2 to 5 on the intercom. I'll buzz you in. After hanging up, she spent the rest of the afternoon organizing files, preparing for whatever this new case might bring. The next morning, Laura parked a few blocks from her office, the crisp morning air biting at her skin. As usual, Randall was camped near the entrance, his sleeping bag neatly rolled beside his backpack. Morning, Laura, he greeted with a nod. Morning, Randall. He stepped aside as she approached the door. Am I the first one here? She asked, fishing out her keys. Randall shook his head. Nope. Mr. Nesbitt came by earlier, said I could stay until now. Laura studied him for a moment. Any trouble last night? None. He grinned. Everyone knows this spot's mine. When Laura first rented the office, several men had competed for the doorway, some causing issues. Calling the cops hadn't helped, so she made a deal with Randall, the biggest and most respectful of the group. She paid him $150 a month to keep the entrance clean and clear. Other tenants, grateful for the arrangement, pitched in too. She had just poured herself a cup of coffee when the intercom buzzed, 12 minutes early. Well, someone's eager. She let David Reynolds in, watching as he settled across from her, gripping his coffee cup. He was an unremarkable man, average height, plain brown hair, forgettable features. But his story was anything but ordinary. Laura opened her notebook as he spoke. 10 years ago, I met Sophia, my wife. Well, ex-wife. She passed 4 months ago. Undiagnosed heart defect. She was only 29. His voice cracked, but when Laura slid a tissue box his way, he waved it off. I met her when she was waitressing at a diner I used to visit. No ring on her finger, so I asked her out. By our second date, she told me she had a 1-year-old son, Gunnar. She was 19, but I didn't care. Met the kid the next day, sweetest boy you'd ever see, always smiling. People thought I was crazy for sticking around, but I was 22 and head over heels. Across the desk, Laura's thoughts flickered to James, who had adopted Emma at that same age without hesitation. Reynolds cleared his throat and continued. Sophia didn't talk much about her past. Said she grew up in Ohio, lost both parents young. Claimed Gunnar's father bailed when she got pregnant. I didn't ask questions. I loved them both. He exhaled sharply. A year later, we got married. Sophia earned her GED, landed a receptionist job. I graduated from the University of Portland and got a remote gig at Nike. I adopted Gunnar within that first year. He's my son. His expression darkened, his voice tightening. Then, for months ago, Sophia's heart gave out. Gunnar and I have been managing, but 3 weeks ago, I got a subpoena for his DNA. Some guy, George Westfall, claims he's the biological father. He surfaced out of nowhere and got a court order. The test confirmed it. Now he's after custody. Laura looked up from her notes, frowning. Any idea why Westfall is showing up now? Reynolds let out a frustrated sigh, rubbing a hand over his face. I think it's on me. Laura raised an eyebrow. While going through Sophia's stuff, I found an old letter she'd written before we met. It mentioned a friend from Ohio she'd stayed with in Indiana. I didn't think much of it, but I found that friend, Megan Hayes, on Facebook and messaged her, just to let her know Sophia had passed. I mentioned Gunnar. His jaw clenched. Next thing I know, some woman from Dayton calls, asking about Gunnar. I got a bad feeling and hung up. A week later, the subpoena arrived. Leaning back, Reynolds exhaled sharply. It's a damn mess. Laura shut her notebook and met his eyes. What do you need from me, Mr. Reynolds? His reply was immediate. I want to keep my son. I don't care who this Westfall guy is. Sophia told me he ran off. I need you to find out who he is, where he's been, and why he suddenly wants Gunnar. I need something to stop the court from taking my son. Laura nodded. I can do that, but I won't lie. This might get expensive. I may need to travel to Ohio. That's fine, Reynolds said without hesitation. Sophia had life insurance. Most of it's for Gunnar, but I've got enough set aside. Just do whatever it takes. Laura leaned forward. Do you have a lawyer handling the custody case? Yeah. Michael Brooks from Braun and Curtis. Laura tapped her pen against the notepad, thinking, all right, Mr. Reynolds. Let's find out who this guy really is. He's the one who recommended you, Reynolds said. Laura nodded. When's the hearing scheduled? Reynolds let out a slow breath. It was set for 2 weeks from now, but Michael filed for a delay. He thinks we can push it back. Good, she said, grabbing an intake form. That gives me time to dig into this. She slid the paper across the desk. I'll need a few details to start. First, Megan Hayes' contact information. Reynolds pulled out his phone and typed in the names and numbers. And the woman who called you. Do you have her info? He scribbled on a notepad and slid it over. Patricia Dawson. Dayton, Ohio. 937-555-2424. Laura scanned the name, then met his eyes. And anything on Gunnar's biological father? Reynolds reached into his bag, pulling out a folder. This is all I've got. Laura flipped through the legal documents. This will do for now. She pulled out a contract. Sign this, and I'll need a check for the retainer. Reynolds signed, slid the check over, and gave a faint smile. Michael said you were the best. Let's hope he's right. Over the next 2 days, Laura chased down every lead she could find, but George Westfall was like a ghost. No digital footprint, no paper trail beyond the DNA results. Frustrated, she called Reynolds. David, have you ever met Westfall in person? No, he said, irritation creeping into his voice. At the meeting with my lawyer, he wasn't there. His attorney said he was traveling and had given him power of attorney. What? Laura jotted a note in the margin of her notebook. Just need a description for my records. I'll be in touch. She hung up before he could ask more. Next, she called Michael Brooks. Michael, where was Westfall's DNA test done? After a short pause, he answered, a clinic in Tempe, Arizona. Laura contacted the clinic, but they refused to release any details without a court order. She called Michael back to get the legal process started. While he worked on that, Laura reached out to Megan Hayes in Toledo. After introducing herself, she didn't have to wait long for Megan to offer up something unexpected. When David messaged me about Sophia, Megan said, I called my mom. She still lives next door to Sophia's stepmom. Turns out, Sophia's dad isn't dead like she claimed. Laura sat up straighter. He's alive. Yeah, he's been living in a trailer park outside Tampa, Megan confirmed. Her voice lowered. And that's not all. Sophia had a half-brother. Real creep. None of us were allowed to sleep over when he was around. He was a few years older than Sophia, joined the army, but still came back on holidays. My mom hasn't seen him in over a year. Laura's mind turned over the new information. Does your mom have Sophia's dad's address? Probably. I'll check and get back to you. Laura's curiosity deepened. Do you know why Sophia left Ohio all those years ago? Megan hesitated. No one really knows. We were in the middle of senior year when she just disappeared. I got one letter from her in Indiana, but after I wrote back, she never responded. My last letter came back undelivered. Laura made a mental note to ask Reynolds for that letter. There might be something useful in it. One more thing, she said. Your stepbrother's last name? Walters. With an E. Got it. Let me know as soon as you have Sophia's dad's address. Will do, Megan promised before hanging up. 15 minutes later, she called back with Thomas Briggs' address and phone number. Laura wasted no time. She dialed immediately. A gruff voice answered. Yeah, Mr. Briggs? My name is Laura Mitchell. I'm a private investigator. I have some information concerning your daughter, Sophia. Would you be willing to meet in person to discuss it? A long pause. Then, suspicion. Where's Sophia? Laura's stomach twisted. He didn't know. Mr. Briggs, I think this is something we should talk about in person. His voice sharpened. You can't just tell me now? Laura kept her tone measured. This isn't the kind of news I'd want to deliver over the phone. More silence. Then, a reluctant sigh. Fine. I'll be around all day. Why wait till Saturday? I'll confirm the time once I land in Tampa, she replied, keeping her voice even. Briggs pressed for more, but Laura gently ended the call. I'll explain everything when we meet. Thank you, Mr. Briggs. She hung up, booked a flight, then called Reynolds to ask for Sophia's old letter. After a layover in Dallas, Laura arrived in Tampa late Friday night. Exhausted but restless, she checked into her hotel and called James. I'm here, she said. Good, he murmured. Try to get some rest. They exchanged I love yous, but Laura lay awake long after the call ended, her mind sifting through the loose threads of the case. The next morning, she called Briggs to confirm their meeting. Come now, he insisted. Using GPS, she followed winding roads to a small trailer park on the outskirts of the city. The air was already thick with humidity, the sun climbing higher as she pulled into the lot. Before she even turned off the ignition, the screen door of a faded single-wide creaked open. A wiry man with graying hair stepped outside, scanning the driveway like he had been waiting for her. Laura got out of the car and approached, keeping her expression neutral but kind. Mr. Briggs? I'm Laura Mitchell. His sharp eye studied her for a beat before he stepped forward, extending a hand. You said this is about Sophia? His voice was steady, but there was something else underneath. Hope, hesitation, and maybe even fear. Laura braced herself. This was about to get complicated. As soon as Laura suggested they head inside, the light in Briggs' eyes dimmed. His shoulders sagged, and without a word, he turned and led her into the trailer. Would you like some coffee? He asked, his voice subdued. Yes, that would be nice. Thank you. The living room was small but tidy, the walls lined with old family photos. Laura took a seat on a worn couch while Briggs disappeared into the kitchen. Moments later, he returned with 2 mugs, setting one in front of her. Cream or sugar? Black is fine, Laura said, taking the cup. They sat across from each other, the silence between them heavy. Laura took a slow breath before speaking. Mr. Briggs, I'm so sorry to tell you this, but your daughter Sophia passed away a few months ago. A heart condition. Briggs stared into his coffee, his hands trembling slightly. His eyes grew glassy. Her mother died the same way, he whispered. He was quiet for a long time before finally looking up. Was she happy? What was her life like? She lived in Portland with her husband, David Reynolds. They were close, seemed happy. She also had a son, Gunnar. He's almost 11 now. David adopted him when he was just a baby. Briggs frowned. She never mentioned us? Told her husband we were dead? Laura nodded, watching him carefully. Do you have any idea why she would say that? Briggs let out a long, weary sigh and leaned back in his chair. It was my fault. After her mother died, I didn't know how to raise Sophia on my own. A few years later, I met Patricia Walters, a single mom with a teenage son, Eric. We got married fast. Eric was wild. I tried to lay down some rules, but Patricia wouldn't have it. His voice took on a distant quality, like he was sifting through old regrets. I loved Patricia too much. Let her take charge of the house while I focused on work. In my relationship with Sophia, it fell apart. His jaw tightened. Eric joined the army after high school. When he came back, he acted like he'd grown up, fooled me good. One Christmas, when Sophia was a senior in high school, Patricia and I went to an office party. Left the kids home. When we got back, he swallowed hard. We found Eric in Sophia's room. On top of her. A chill ran through Laura. Sophia said Eric had assaulted her. Eric claimed she had seduced him. It was his word against hers. His voice cracked, thick with regret. And Patricia, she sided with her son, started throwing around accusations, saying Sophia had been sleeping around. He exhaled shakily. And I believed my wife over my own daughter. His eyes drifted to the wall of family photos, pictures of Sophia as a little girl, a teenager, her mother smiling beside her. Slowly, he stood and pulled one of the frames down, his fingers trembling as he held it. This was the last time I saw my little girl, he murmured. A week later, she was gone. The room felt thick with silence. Laura finally asked, "When did you find out the truth?" Briggs let out a bitter laugh. Not soon enough. He set the picture back in place. Eric went back to Fort Bragg, and less than 2 months later, I got a call. A civilian on base accused him of assault. Same story, he said, she said. But that time, I couldn't deny it anymore. His hands balled into fists. The army didn't have enough to charge him, but they dishonorably discharged him. Patricia still defended him, refused to believe it. Briggs ran a hand over his face. I reached out to Megan, Sophia's friend. Asked about those rumors Patricia had spread. Megan was furious, swore Sophia was one of the good ones. That there was never any truth to it. He let out another breath, his voice filled with quiet regret. I wrote to Sophia when Megan gave me her address in Indiana. Never got a reply. His expression suddenly softened. You said Sophia had a son? Laura nodded. Do you have a picture of him? Laura pulled out a photo of Gunnar and handed it over. Briggs studied it, his face shifting from awe to something darker. His grip on the photo tightened. Oh my God, he whispered. Then, louder, son of a bitch. Laura stiffened. What's wrong? Briggs' face had gone pale. This boy, Gunnar, he looks exactly like Eric. Laura's heart pounded. That can't be right. A DNA test confirmed Gunnar's father is a man named George Westfall. Briggs shook his head slowly, still staring at the photo. I swear on my life, that boy is Eric's spitting image. Laura's mind spun. That's why she hadn't been able to find any trace of George Westfall. The name was a lie. The pieces of the puzzle were finally snapping into place. Briggs' voice cut through her thoughts. Do you think David Reynolds would let me meet the boy? I'll find out, Laura promised. Then she added, but until I figure out what's going on, I need you to keep this quiet. We need to know why someone using the name George Westfall matches Gunnar's DNA. Briggs gave a solemn nod. I don't talk to anyone from back home anyway. But be careful. If Megan's mom had my number, people can track you down. Laura left the trailer, her mind racing as she drove straight to the airport. She booked the first flight to Ohio, arriving late that night and checking into a modest hotel just outside Dayton. By morning, she had already mapped out her next move. Sunday afternoon, she pulled up in front of an aging craftsman-style house. The paint was peeling, the yard overgrown, a clear sign of neglect. Laura stepped out of the car and knocked firmly on the front door. It creaked open to reveal an older woman with sharp eyes, deep-set wrinkles, and a permanent scowl. Laura didn't wait for pleasantries. She stepped forward, forcing the woman to back up into the living room. Mrs. Dawson, I'm here to talk about your son, Eric. Her tone was calm but firm. When's the last time you saw him? The woman blinked, clearly caught off guard by the sudden intrusion. Who are you? What do you want with Eric? Laura met her glare without flinching. I'm a private investigator from Portland, Laura said evenly. I'm looking into a paternity case involving a young boy there. I think you might have some answers. Mrs. Dawson's expression shifted from confusion to anger in an instant. Her eyes narrowed as she spat out. If some little tramp had Eric's baby, I deserve to know about it. That boy is my grandson. She had no right to hide him from me. Laura watched her carefully, looking for any flicker of guilt. If you're so sure, then why is a man named George Westfall claiming to be the boy's father? Mrs. Dawson's face went pale. She opened her mouth as if to respond, but before she could, a man's voice bellowed from deeper in the house. Patricia, who the hell is at the door? Get in here. Without another glance at Laura, Mrs. Dawson spun around and rushed toward the voice, leaving Laura standing alone in the dimly lit living room. Raised voices erupted from the back of the house, sharp and frantic, but the words were muffled. Seizing the opportunity, Laura quickly scanned the room. The mantel was cluttered with family photos, some dusty and crooked. She discreetly snapped a few pictures with her phone. In one frame, a young boy, clearly Eric, stared back at her, his features eerily similar to Gunnar's. Laura's gut clenched. She was closer to the truth than ever. By the time Mrs. Dawson returned, her face was flushed, her mouth pressed into a thin, Angry line. My husband says I don't have to answer your questions, she snapped. So you're not going to tell me where Eric is or why this George Westfall is claiming to be the boy's father? Mrs. Dawson hesitated. I can't, she stammered, her bravado slipping. Now get out of my house. Laura walked toward the door but paused just before stepping outside. She turned back, her voice calm but firm. I think you'll regret not talking to me. Mrs. Dawson's face twisted with fury. You don't know who you're dealing with. Get out, or I'll call the cops. Unfazed, Laura stepped out into the crisp evening air and closed the door behind her. Her mind raced as she walked to her car. Later that evening, she boarded a flight from Dayton to O'Hare, where she faced a 2-hour layover before heading back to Portland. Exhaustion pulled at her, but adrenaline kept her alert. The night before, she had tried digging up information on Eric Walters using the hotel's sluggish Wi-Fi, but it was as if he had vanished off the face of the earth. Monday morning, she'd have to call in some favors. A man like Eric had to have left a trail somewhere. As she was closing her notebook after jotting down her thoughts, a stocky man approached her. Miss Laura Mitchell? He asked. Laura's eyes flicked up, cautious. The man flashed a badge. U.S. Marshals. He handed her a business card. Daniel Harper, U.S. Marshals. Mind if I sit? Laura glanced at his badge and ID, then nodded to the empty seat across from her. We know you've been in contact with Thomas Briggs and Patricia Dawson about Eric Walters, Harper said. Mind telling me why? Laura, no stranger to law enforcement tactics, met his gaze evenly. I'm investigating a paternity case involving someone named George Westfall, but I'm guessing you already know that's not his real name. Harper let out a dry chuckle, leaning back. You're good. Yeah, we know Westfall is Eric Walters. Laura allowed herself a tight smile. Figured as much. So, you want to tell me why Eric Walters is in witness protection? Harper grinned faded. I can't give you all the details, but he helped a district attorney in South Florida take down a major cartel. That DA's riding high off the arrests, maybe eyeing a run for governor or senator. Protecting Walters is part of keeping that success story intact. Laura's expression darkened. So, you're protecting a man who assaulted his teenage sister, attacked another woman at Fort Bragg, got tangled up with pill traffickers, and now wants custody of a kid who only knows David Reynolds as his father? Harper, jaw tightened, and for a moment, he looked genuinely uncomfortable. Walters doesn't give a damn about the kid, he admitted. His mother does. Once Walters gets custody, that boy's going straight to her. Laura stared at him, incredulous. You've got to be kidding. Have you met that woman? Harper shook his head. No. And I'm not eager to. He sighed. Look, people in WITSEC aren't all heroes. Sometimes they're just the ones who cut the best deals to stay out of prison. Walters is one of those. Laura folded her arms. So what exactly are you expecting from me? You want me to tell my client to roll over and hand his son to this garbage? Harper's voice dropped lower. Off the record, I think Eric Walters belongs behind bars, not in protection. But my hands are tied. I'm telling you this because I know you'll handle it right. He hesitated before adding, and for what it's worth, there are people in Bogota who'd love to find Walters. Not just because he snitched, but because he stole from them. Just as Harper finished speaking, Laura's flight was announced. He stood, slipping his badge back into his pocket. Good luck, Miss Mitchell. Thanks for hearing me out. Without another word, he melted into the crowd. By the time Laura's plane touched down at Portland International, it was just past 9 p.m. She was bone-tired, but knowing James was waiting for her outside gave her a sense of relief. As she cleared security and stepped into the arrivals area, she spotted him immediately. He stood near the curb, holding a bouquet of flowers, his face lighting up the moment he saw her. Maybe it was the exhaustion, but Laura felt her throat tighten, her chest warm at the sight of him. James pulled her into a firm hug. Welcome home, babe. Laura kissed him softly, taking the flowers from his hand. It's only been 3 days, James. Felt longer, he murmured, pressing a kiss to her forehead. Let's get you home. Laura glanced at the bouquet, smirking. Flowers, huh? What's the occasion? James chuckled, tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. 3 days without you felt like a month. I figured you could use something nice after the chaos you've been dealing with. She let out a soft laugh. You have no idea. Just wait until I tell you about Chicago. She had already told him about her theory, how George Westfall was really Eric Walters and had assaulted his own sister, but things had taken an even darker turn. On the way home, Laura filled him in on everything that had happened in Dayton and her unexpected run-in with the U.S. Marshal at O'Hare. James listened in silence, his hands gripping the wheel a little tighter as the story unraveled. When she finally finished, he sighed. So, where do you go from here? Laura exhaled, staring out the window. I don't know yet. I'm walking a tightrope between the Colombians, a DA looking to make a name for himself, and Eric Walters hiding in WITSEC. There's no clean way to handle this. I just hope David and Gunnar don't get caught in the crossfire. The moment Laura stepped inside their house, the tension from the past few days started to fade. The smell of home-cooked food, the hum of the TV in the background, and the warmth of family wrapped around her like a much-needed blanket. Mom. Nathan grinned as he greeted her with a tight hug. For the next 15 minutes, she let herself enjoy being home, listening to Nathan ramble about his weekend and the latest drama involving his new girlfriend. It was a welcome distraction. A long, hot shower washed away the exhaustion, and after slipping into her favorite lounge clothes, Laura padded downstairs, finding James in his office with 2 glasses of wine. He knew better than to push for more case talk. She needed to decompress if she had any hope of sleeping that night. Before long, they were laughing over the latest neighborhood antics. This place is unbelievable, James chuckled. Mark Preston spent all of Saturday spray-painting patio furniture in his garage. Didn't think about the wind? Ended up turning Rachel's brand-new Mercedes into a work of modern art. Laura nearly spit out her wine. Wait, Rachel's brand-new Benz? The one she just bought? Oh yeah. I was outside working on that damn bush you wanted gone when I heard her scream. By the time I got over there, she'd already grabbed the spray can from Mark and doused his shirt in paint. Laura cackled. And what did Mark do? Ripped his shirt off, grabbed Rachel, and dragged her inside, swearing he'd repaint the car himself. She shook her head, laughing harder. Those two are ridiculous. Everything turns them on. They've only been married a year, James said, shaking his head. Let's see if that energy survives, kids. Laura shot him a playful look. Didn't slow you down, Mr. Mitchell. That's because I married you, he grinned. Laura grinned back, closing the small gap between them as she dropped onto his lap. They were mid-kiss when Nathan poked his head in the doorway. Hey, lovebirds, do me a favor, keep it down tonight, will ya? James smirked. No promises. With a laugh, he scooped Laura into his arms and carried her upstairs. For the first time in days, she let herself enjoy the moment, pushing all the tension and stress to the back of her mind. Meanwhile, 1,000 miles away, Eric Walters was slamming his phone down after another explosive call with his mother. For half an hour, she had ranted, alternating between sobs and rage about the grandson she insisted had been stolen from her. You need to do something, Patricia shrieked. That detective, she was in my house. That nosy bitch knows something. Ma, I told you, I'm handling it. Eric snapped. But I can't just waltz in and take him. I've got to be careful. If the feds figure out that Westfall is really me, I'm dead. Well, you'd better figure something out fast, she spat. Eric rubbed his temple, frustration burning in his gut. He knew Laura Mitchell wasn't just poking around blindly. She had pieced together way too much. That meant it was time for him to shut this down. By Monday morning, he had found Mitchell Investigations online. The same website that helped Laura's business thrive made it painfully easy to track her down. By noon, his flight to Portland was booked. The next day, Laura arrived at her office, still feeling the exhaustion from her trip. David Reynolds was scheduled to stop by for a lunchtime meeting to discuss the case. She could have updated him over the phone, but with things spiraling out of control and invoices piling up, meeting in person seemed smarter. Unlocking the office door, she spotted Randall across the street, standing outside a grocery store with his hat out for spare change. He waved, and she waved back, neither of them noticing the broad-shouldered man loitering a few doors down. Minutes later, another tenant entered the building, and Eric slipped in behind them, flashing a confident smile and claiming he had an appointment with a detective upstairs. Laura was at her desk, flipping through case notes, when Eric stepped inside. He didn't bother with introductions. He loomed over her desk, his stance aggressive, his presence radiating menace. You need to back off, he growled, jabbing a finger toward her. Leave my mother alone. Stay out of my business. And tell David Reynolds to drop it. Eric Walters had built his entire life on intimidation. He was bigger than most men, stronger than most men, and nastier than most men. And it had always worked until now. Because Eric Walters had just made a critical mistake. Laura didn't scare easy. Without hesitation, she grabbed his outstretched finger and twisted it back toward his wrist, bending it sharply enough that pain shot up his arm. Eric barely had time to react before she reached under her desk, pulled out a pistol, and leveled it squarely at his face. Her voice was calm, deadly. Get the hell out of my office. Eric stood frozen for a beat, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. This scrawny woman thinks she can order me around? No one tells Eric Walters what to do. But the cold steel of the pistol aimed at his face made him reconsider. Laura's steady grip on the gun didn't waver, her expression unreadable. Eric took a slow step back, then another, retreating toward the door. "You'll regret this, Mitchell," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. "You have no idea how sorry you're gonna be." Laura didn't flinch. Eric backed into the hallway, muttering under his breath, "Bitch is gonna wish she never crossed me," before disappearing down the stairs. The moment he was gone, Laura calmly locked the door and reached for her phone. She didn't hesitate as she dialed a number from memory. Daniel Harper answered on the first ring. "Harper, it's Mitchell," she said flatly. "Your guy just walked into my office and threatened me. We're past the point of warnings. Thought you might want to know." She hung up before he could respond. If he had, she knew it would have been the same bureaucratic nonsense. "We'll keep an eye on it. Stay out of it, Miss Mitchell. Eric Walters is under protection." None of that mattered anymore. Eric had made it personal. She wasn't done. Laura immediately placed another call, this time to Ryan Carter. For the next 20 minutes, she laid it all out. The tangled mess of Eric's fake identity, the threats, and the fact that this wasn't just a custody battle anymore. "You've still got DEA contacts?" she asked. "Think you can get me in touch with someone in Colombia?" Under normal circumstances, Ryan would have told her to slow down, think it through. But this wasn't just business anymore. Eric Walters had threatened Laura, and that made it personal for Ryan, too. "No one threatens the mother of my kid," Ryan said, his voice tight, "or the wife of my best friend. I'll make some calls. But Laura, watch your back." That evening, Laura sat James down and told him she needed to go to New York. She didn't sugarcoat anything, laying out every ugly detail, the risks, the plan, what she was trying to accomplish. James listened without interrupting, but Laura didn't miss the way his jaw clenched tighter with every piece of information. Later that night, long after Laura had fallen asleep, James was still lying awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. He finally gave up and grabbed his phone, dialing a number he hadn't called in a long time. It was 1 a.m. in New York, but Ryan picked up on the first ring. "Yeah." His voice was rough with sleep, but instantly alert. "It's James," he said quietly. "Laura told me what you two were planning." Ryan was silent for a beat before responding. "I figured she would. Is she gonna be safe?" Another pause. Then Ryan sighed. "I'll do everything I can." James swallowed hard, his throat tight. "I can't lose her, Ryan. Does she really have to be there?" "You know how she is," Ryan said gently. "You married her." James let out a long breath, running a hand over his face. "Yeah, I know. She thinks she needs to be there," Ryan added. "Even if it's just to cover my back." James gritted his teeth. "I wouldn't let her do this for anyone else, you know that?" "I know," Ryan said quietly. "That's why I won't let anything happen to her." The line was silent for a long moment before James finally murmured, "Thanks, man. Get some rest, James." "You too." They hung up, but neither of them slept that night. For days later, Laura was in New York. She and Ryan had set up a meeting with Victor Delgado, a man with deep ties to the Colombian cartels. In those 4 days, Ryan had confirmed that Eric Walters wasn't just hiding because he had flipped on his old crew. He had stolen at least $4 million from them. And the Colombians weren't just looking for him. They were looking to settle a debt. The meeting took place at a private hangar at a small airport outside the city. A sleek jet sat in the background, starkly contrasting with the 7 metal folding chairs arranged in a rough circle on the concrete floor. When one of the Colombians stepped forward to search them for weapons, Ryan lifted an eyebrow. "What? You think we're dumb enough to start something here?" he said coolly. "I see 5 of you. You keep your weapons, we keep ours." The man hesitated, then glanced at someone seated in the circle. A subtle nod granted permission. Ryan and Laura stepped forward, taking their seats under the harsh fluorescent lights. Laura kept quiet. This was Ryan's world, and she knew when to let him take the lead. Introductions were made, and then Ryan got straight to the point. "If we give you his alias and tell you where to find him," he said, "what's the reward?" To Laura's surprise, it wasn't Delgado who answered. A younger man, Luis, leaned forward, eyes sharp with suspicion. "What exactly are you asking for?" 10% of whatever you recover, Ryan said smoothly. The room went silent. Luis smirked, shaking his head. "Or," he sneered, "we could just beat it out of you and save our boss 10%. Ryan didn't even blink. That'd be short-sighted. Luis opened his mouth, but Ryan wasn't done. He leaned forward slightly, his tone casual, almost amused. "Laura's got NYPD connections. I've got friends at Langley. They all know we're here. And I'm sure some of them would love an excuse to drop a drone on Delgado's house in Bogota." Luis paled slightly. His gaze flickered toward Delgado, whose face remained impassive. After a moment, Delgado spoke in Spanish, low and firm. Luis immediately shut his mouth. Then Delgado turned back to Ryan with a practiced smile. "Please excuse my young associate," he said smoothly. "He's watched too many of your Hollywood movies. He thinks tough talk earns respect." Ryan smirked. "We were all young once." Delgado chuckled. "Yes, but he's still learning." He clasped his hands together. "Do you think 5% is fair? There will be costs before we recover anything." Ryan glanced at Laura, who gave a subtle nod. 5% works, Ryan said. "How do you want payment handled?" "An account in the Caymans," Delgado replied. 5% within a month of recovery. Ryan didn't ask if Delgado could be trusted. Despite his criminal reputation, the man was known for keeping his word. As they stepped out of the hangar into the cool night air, Laura finally broke the silence. "Well," she said dryly, "that was fun." Ryan smirked as he drove. "It's dirty money, Ryan," Laura said flatly. "Then donate it," he shrugged. She shot him a sharp look. "When did you get so cynical?" He chuckled dryly. "Probably after too many years in government work. You know how many politicians get rich in Congress? You think that money's clean?" Laura shook her head, a wry smile tugging at her lips. "You're cynical. And you're not?" Her smile faded. "I'm not losing sleep over Walters," she muttered. "One less rapist in the world." Ryan glanced at her. "Now that's cynical." They drove in silence as the Manhattan skyline loomed ahead. After a while, Ryan spoke again. "When the money comes in, give me a third. Keep the rest." Laura frowned. "I was going to split it 50-50. "I know," Ryan said, "but you earned it." She sighed, shaking her head. "I can't bring that kind of money into the States." "Then spend it overseas. Take James on some tropical vacations. Escape those Portland winters." Laura smiled but didn't commit. "Let's see how this plays out first." A week passed with no updates. Laura did her best to keep David Reynolds calm, offering reassurances she wasn't sure she could back up. The custody hearing was in 2 weeks, and David's anxiety was growing. On a gray Portland morning, James pulled up in front of Laura's office. As she stepped out, she noticed something was off. Randall wasn't there. He sometimes spent nights at his girlfriend's tent, but Laura's gut told her something was wrong. She pushed the thought aside, unlocking her office, when everything suddenly went black. A violent, searing pain shot through her as electricity surged through her body. The world exploded in white-hot agony before fading into darkness. When she came to, she was tied to a chair, a gag so tight she could barely breathe. Her head throbbed. As her vision cleared, she saw him. Eric Walters. He stood in front of her, a hunting knife in his hand, grinning. "Awake, Laura?" "Good," he sneered. "Time for some fun." "Well, for me, at least." Her stomach twisted. Then she saw the blood on the knife handle. Not hers. Randall. A wave of nausea swept through her, but she forced herself to stay calm. Eric lowered the blade from his face to his chest, and Laura suddenly became aware of the fact that she was in nothing but her undergarments. "Figured out where we are yet?" Eric taunted. Laura's eyes darted around the room. "The 5th floor of your building," he continued smugly. "2 empty floors between us and anyone who might hear you scream. Not that it'll matter." His grin widened as he stepped closer, his free hand moving to his belt. "I thought about a ball gag," he mused. "But I'd miss those sweet little sounds you're about to make." Laura's pulse pounded in her ears. Think. Eric took another step, then thwip. A sharp sound cut through the room. Eric stiffened, eyes wide. A dart protruded from his neck. What the? His hand shot to his throat, but his knees buckled before he could finish the thought. His body crumpled to the floor. Laura barely had time to process what was happening before three masked men entered the room. They moved with precision, grabbing Eric's unconscious body and hauling him away like a bag of trash. Seconds later, Victor Delgado stepped into view, holding Laura's blouse in one hand and a knife in the other. "Let me get you out of this," he said quietly. He moved efficiently, slicing through the plastic ties around her wrists and pulling the gag free. He handed her the blouse without so much as glancing at her exposed skin. Laura quickly slipped it on, grateful when he passed her prosthetic leg and trousers. "Fausto was watching the building," Victor explained. "He called the moment Walters showed up. We were already monitoring his place in Tempe, your office, and your home. Our jet was waiting in Sacramento. As soon as we got word, we flew in." Laura flexed her fingers, regaining feeling in her hands. "I can't believe I let him ambush me," she muttered. Victor gave a tight smile. "Where we're taking him, it's better you don't know. But I promise, he won't be a problem for you or anyone else again." Laura met his gaze. "And Randall?" Victor's expression darkened. "Fausto didn't have time to stop Walters before he exhaled, jaw tight. "I'm sorry. If it had gone any further with you, Fausto wouldn't have waited." Laura swallowed the lump in her throat. Randall had been a good man. He hadn't deserved that. She took a slow breath, steadying herself. "Tell Fausto thank you." Victor nodded. "I need a favor. Wait 3 hours before calling the police about Randall. That's how long it'll take us to clear U.S. airspace." Laura closed her eyes for a brief moment. She hated it, but she understood. "I can wait," she finally said. "But I'll probably ask my husband to stay with me today." "Smart move." Victor studied her carefully. "Think the U.S. Marshals will give you trouble?" She shook her head. "I'll be fine. The DA in Florida might throw a tantrum, but he can shove it." Victor chuckled. "You've got grace, Mitchell." He hesitated for a moment, then leaned in, pressing a light kiss to her forehead before stepping back. "You remind me of someone I once knew." He started to leave, then glanced over his shoulder. "You'll know if the funds hit your account, but I doubt we'll meet again." And just like that, he was gone. Laura sat there for a long moment, trying to process it all. She had always known there were shades of gray in the world, that sometimes the people on the wrong side of the law had more honor than the ones wearing badges. But that didn't mean she wouldn't put Victor behind bars if she had the chance. Her legs were shaky as she walked back into her office, but she didn't let it slow her down. She picked up her phone and dialed. "James? Can you take the afternoon off?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I need you." James was there within minutes. They waited together until 4 hours had passed. Then Laura made an anonymous call to report Randall's body. No one claimed him. No official investigation followed. Laura paid for his cremation and scattered his ashes on Mount Hood. Randall had always said how much he loved seeing Mount Hood on clear days. Scattering his ashes there felt right. The next morning, Laura met with David Reynolds. "You probably don't need to worry about George Westfall anymore," she told him. "My sources say he's gone for good." When George failed to show up for the custody hearing, the judge granted David permanent custody of Gunner. Patricia Dawson called repeatedly, but David made it clear she'd never see the boy. Her attempts to take him had sealed her fate. Thomas Briggs, Sophia's father, was allowed to meet his grandson. He took the train to Portland and stayed for a week, spending time with the boy he never knew existed. One afternoon, he asked Laura to meet him for coffee. "Thank you for softening David up," he said quietly. "I know that was you." "Mr. Briggs," Laura replied gently, "you can't spend your whole life beating yourself up over something that happened more than a decade ago." "Yes, I can," Briggs murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "Sophia was a good girl. She depended on me to protect her. After her mother died, I failed her. I pray heaven exists so Sophia can be there with her mom. But me? If there's a hell, that's where I belong." Laura sat in silence for a moment before choosing her words carefully. "Almost every faith teaches forgiveness," she said. "Talk to a priest, a minister, or even a rabbi. If you're truly sorry, you need to forgive yourself. From what David's told me, Sophia would want that for you. Briggs looked up, his eyes glistening. You remind me of Sophia's mother, he whispered. She always knew the right thing to say, even when it was wishful thinking. I was lost after she died. Laura placed a hand over his, giving it a gentle squeeze. Thank you, Briggs whispered. He patted her hand, stood, and left the cafe. His shoulders seemed just a little lighter. 3 months later, an email notification popped up on Laura's screen. Your account has been replenished. She ran every antivirus and keylogging program Nathan had installed before logging into the Cayman account. The deposit was there, $156,000. Without hesitation, she wired a third to Ryan's account in Dubai. Another third went to a Canadian charity that rescued trafficked children. The last third, she kept, unsure of what she'd do with it. A year later, she spent it on something that felt right. She treated her family and a few close friends to a week at a private beach villa on Little Cayman. One night, well past midnight, Laura and James slipped away from the villa, wrapped in robes. The sky was clear, moonless, and alive with stars. Except for a dim light near the door, there was no artificial glow to spoil the view. I can't believe you talked me into this, Laura whispered as she removed her prosthesis, letting her robe fall to the sand. James grinned, scooping her into his arms. Come on. When else will we get to skinny dip under a sky like this? Laura didn't answer, but her smile was enough. He carried her into the warm Caribbean waves. Once waist deep, she floated on her back, gazing up at the infinite stars. Her damp skin shimmered in the starlight, and James, treading water beside her, admired the peaceful beauty of the moment. He knew better than to push for more. It wasn't the time, but being there, just with her, was enough. Not far away, back on the beach, Nathan and his girlfriend Jessica lay on a towel, whispering. Though the night was dark as ink, they could just make out the two familiar figures heading toward the water, dropping their robes. Oh God, Nathan whispered, realization hitting. No, no, no. Jessica stifled a giggle. I think it's sweet. Nathan groaned. What if it were your parents? Jessica winced. Okay, gross, but still kind of cute. Nathan shook his head. I still can't believe they invited you on this trip. They like me, Jessica said, her voice softening. She hesitated before adding, do you think we have a chance to be as happy as they are? Nathan's heart swelled. I hope so. He kissed her deeply, the warm Caribbean breeze wrapping around them. In just a month, they'd be heading off to college. The odds were against them, but some couples beat the odds. As they lay back on the towel, staring up at the endless, star-filled sky, everything felt possible.